From the dimly lit garage of two car lovers emerged a masterpiece on wheels, a car so exceptional that it earned the revered title of the 007 vehicle and the car of choice for the esteemed royal family of Wales, symbolizing both luxury and power. Aston Martin now produces some of the best cars on the road and on the racetracks. However, their path to success carries one of the wildest stories of success and failure, wealth and bankruptcy, luxury and poverty. So stay with us in this video as we dive into the story about how one of the biggest car companies in the world fell down the hill to be sold for £110 after featuring in James Bond, and how it rose back up to glory and fame that we all know today. On January 15, 1913, two friends named Lionel Martin and Robert Bamford, who had a love for cars, decided to join hands to start an automobile shop. They gave birth to what was at the time called Bamford and Martin, which was derived from their last names. They sold cars made by Singer and serviced GWK and Calthrope vehicles. The two, however, were not satisfied with what they did and decided to take it a step further. At the time, Martin was a race car driver at Aston Hill, so the two decided to make their own race cars that would race down the hill and take over the world. And then came the Coal Scuttle. The first Aston Martin car was built using a redesigned Coventry simplex engine. The partners were more than likely excited to put their prototype on the tracks, but World War I pulled the brakes on all their ambitions. They had to wait until 1919 before they could get one vehicle on the tracks. Just as everyone who owned a business through the First World War had to stop production and almost close shop, however, they came back in 1919 to pick up where they left off, and it was quite a success. The Coal Scuttle won gold at the London to Edinburgh time trial. Things finally starting to look good for the partners, but in 1920, Bamford left Martin to run the company by himself. Martin had to do something about the company that was already in decline. So, in an attempt to revitalize the business, Martin tried to get investors on the drawing board. As a result, they got funding from a British count who was also a race car driver. His name was Louis Zaborski. Thanks to Zaborski, Bamford and Martin made a car that was strong and fast enough to compete in the French Grand Prix. They sold 55 cars afterwards and were on their way to being fully revitalized. However, they ran into financial problems again in 1924. The company went bankrupt, but it was rescued by Lady Charnwood, who bought the company and put her son on the board. Shortly afterwards, during the following year, the company ran into bankruptcy again. This time, however, Martin completely sold the company to one of his investors, Augustus Bert Bertelli. That year, August Bertelli and some of the major investors, including Lady Charnwood, took control of the company. This marked the end of Bamford and Martin as a brand. Bertelli and his partners renamed the company Aston Martin, taking it from Aston Hill, where Louis Martin used to race. The new owner, who was also the technical director and designer, decided to focus all the company's efforts on sports cars. He made a few models of his, including the T-Type, International, MK2, and Ulster. Bertelli had a good run with the company, but it sadly came to a close when they had financial problems again in 1932. This time, the company was bailed out by Lance Prideaux Brune, who eventually passed the company to Arthur Sutherland. As a way to solve the company's problems, Sutherland decided the company needed to focus on making commercial vehicles. So, the company decided to focus on its own cars until the beginning of the Second World War. Just like in the previous war, the Second World War slowed down activities on all levels of the economy. To survive, Aston Martin had to shift their focus from producing road cars to the production of aircraft components. After the war was over, the company changed hands again in 1947. This time, it was taken over by an automobile and machine tool manufacturer called Dan Brown. Dan Brown owned a tractor group, which he put Aston Martin underneath, and at the time, he had just acquired Lagonda without its factory. Because of this, it was easy to form a partnership between Lagonda and Aston Martin. The car company and Lagonda shared engine resources and workshops that paved the way to a new era of road cars that saved the company for a while. Lagonda was working on a new V6 engine that had the DB initials. These engines were to be used in the new Le Mans prototype that would be called the DB2. After that, they built the other models like the DB24, the DB4, DB5, DB6, and the DBS. These models became even more iconic when they appeared in James Bond films over the next few years. The Aston Martin eventually became the most iconic British car, and it was a sign of luxury and prestige. But it was never far from some financial trouble or another. In 1972, the company was said to be in about £5 million of debt. It was struggling, there was a recession, and people just weren't able to afford cars anymore, especially not Aston Martins. As a result, Dan Brown decided to pay off all of Aston Martin's debt. However, he had to sell the company afterwards, and he did so for £101. As though he could not find anyone who wanted Aston Martin, he handed the company over to a Birmingham-based investment bank. The receiver then sold the company in 1975 for £1.05 million to a North American businessman, Peter Sprague. Despite inviting his business partners, Sprague guaranteed the journalists that Aston Martin would remain a British-controlled business. He also claimed that he fell in love with the factories. 6 months later, he reopened the factory under the name Aston Martin Lagonda with about 100 staff. The new owner sought to increase the staff in a few months and to modernize the Aston Martin vehicles. With that in mind, they introduced the V8 Vantage, the convertible Volante, and the one-off Bulldog. They also came up with a new Lagonda logo. Curtis, an investor with a 20% stake in the company, brought about some changes in the company as well. He made the customer base change from the usual that they had to married and successful businessmen. Their prices increased by 25%, and there were even some rumors that Aston Martin Lagonda was planning to buy Lamborghini. The company saw some significant growth under Peter Sprague and Alan Curtis. However, they went through some financial problems that led them to cut their staff by 20% and sell a stake in the company, all because of a recession. This share of the company was said to be sold for £500,000 to Pace Petroleum's Victor Gauntlet. Another investor named Tim Hearley from CH Industrials also bought similar shares in Aston Martin. Hearley and Gauntlet took over as joint 50-50 owners of the company. However, Gauntlet was the executive chairman and the head of the sales team. They made the Aston Martin Lagonda into the fastest four-seater production car in the world, and with some publicity and marketing, they sold it in Oman, Kuwait, and Qatar. In 1982, Aston Martin was granted a royal warrant of appointment by the Prince of Wales. They became the supplier of automobiles to the royal family. As oil and gas trading became tighter in the 1980s, Aston Martin required more time and money to produce their state-of-the-art vehicles. This led to very poor production by the company, with only 30 cars produced in 1982. The company needed funds badly, so Gauntlet sold his company, Hayes & Pace. He eventually sold his shareholding in Aston Martin to generate more money. In 1986, he negotiated the casting of Aston Martin in the new James Bond movie that starred Timothy Dalton. Gauntlet also went further to supply his pre-production perspective for use in the filming of The Living Daylights. These steps were successes in the short term, but Aston Martin needed funds for the long term. That is where Ford came in. In 1987, Ford purchased a 75% stake in Aston Martin. The vice president of Ford in Europe, Walter Hayes, said that he saw potential in the brand and discussed an acquisition by Ford. A year later, Aston Martin retired the ancient V8 and introduced the Virage range. Gauntlet was contracted to stay as chairman for 2 years, and within that time limit, he brought Aston Martin back into sports racing in 1989. However, they had very limited success in Europe. In 1991, Gauntlet handed over the chairmanship to Hayes, and a high-performance variant of the Virage called the Vantage was announced. This led to the renewal of the DB series with a new DB7. 2 years later, Ford acquired a full stake in Aston Martin, and they began investing in the company's manufacturing and production. In 1995, the company sold a record 700 cars. Aston Martin would eventually go back into sports racing and improve their V8 engine, creating V12 variants. The company was more stable than it ever was. However, uncertainty loomed once again when an internal audit led Ford to consider selling part of its premier automatic group. Ford had the option to sell one between Land Rover, Jaguar, Volvo, or Aston Martin. Sadly, they chose Aston Martin to be auctioned off. In March of 2007, a group led by ProDrive's chairman, David Richards, bought Aston Martin for £475 million. The group included an American investment banker, John Sinders, and two Kuwaiti companies, namely Investment Dar and Adim Investments. 6 years later, in 2013, Aston Martin officially signed a deal with the Mercedes-Benz Group, which was known at the time as Daimler. This meant that the next generation of Aston Martins was to be provided with Mercedes-AMG engines and electrical systems. This partnership was to help Aston Martin roll in a new generation of cars with better engines and state-of-the-art technology. However, Mercedes-Benz got as much as 5% equity in Aston Martin and a non-voting seat on the board as their profit from the deal. The first Aston Martin model to feature the new technology was the DB11, announced at the 86th Geneva Auto Show in 2016. It featured Mercedes-Benz technology in its entertainment and navigation systems, as well as a Mercedes-AMG V8 engine. In late 2020, Mercedes-Benz confirmed that they would increase their stake in Aston Martin from 5% to 20%. In return, Aston Martin was granted access to Mercedes-Benz hybrid and electric drivetrain technologies. In 2018, Aston Martin was listed for the first time on the London Stock Exchange as Aston Martin Lagonda Global Holdings, after turning around a year-to-year loss-making company in late 1990s and the early 2000s. The company could now be valued at £5 billion, which is a long way from the bankrupt company that once sold for £101. The brand itself is now a symbol of prestige, wealth, and luxury, as well as very fast cars. They've taken their place once again in motorsports while making some of the fastest road cars on the planet. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Can Aston Martin keep rising to the level of other luxury cars like Bentley and Rolls-Royce? Also, if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.